towards Mark here. Now let's get granular into what you have found, Mark, has worked in growing HubSpot into an absolute machine. And maybe, Mark, I'll start on this slide here and kick it off and transitioning what you've learned through what Mary has talked about, especially at a macro level. What has it meant within your business?
Yeah, sure, Jamie. It's meant a lot, and honestly, we saw really early indications of this even like 8 or 9 years ago, before everybody was talking about the change in the buyer behavior. And I'm going to walk you through some of the process that we went through to even kind of prove and discover this, at least for our context. But let me start with just let's dive into the sales hiring, which I, as we talk about a little later, it's honestly one of the biggest drivers of sales success, just getting the right people into the company. You're going to walk up a really, big hill if you're getting mediocre folks in and you're relying on training and development to get those folks. It's so much easier to put, triple down on your efforts to hire and hire predictably in scaling a team. So one of the stories I'll share here is early on in our development, I had the luxury or had the success of recruiting one of the top salespeople at a huge public company here in Boston, literally 800 people on their team, and this person was number one. And, we were a no-name at the time. I think we probably had 20, 30 people in our company. Very few people understood who we were. No one really understood what inbound marketing was. And I literally rolled out the red carpet when this person arrived, thinking that they would completely redefine the way that we sold. And they didn't do terribly, but they didn't crush it either. And that perplexed me. How could this person from an 800-person team not come into this new company that was pretty new to our sales motion and just not show us the way? And as I reflected on that, I realized, wow, the context from where they were coming from couldn't have been more different than what we were doing at the time. They were coming from an extremely mature business, an extremely mature industry, a very transactional sell. And we were completely evangelistic, and we were kind of bridging into the area of all the stuff that Mary talked about, of buyers that needed to be educated and had a higher expectation of what contribution salespeople made. And I was just like, picturing the person that succeeds in that big company, mature industry context, it's going to be so different than who succeeds here. And that's where I realized that this is really about understanding my unique buyer context for HubSpot at the time. And I put together something that looked like what you see on the screen here, which is just, a theory of 10 criteria that, given our context and our buyer and all the trends that we saw unfolding that Mary was talking about, what type of salesperson would succeed for us? And I was pretty disciplined about defining what each one of these criteria was, what a score of a 1, a 5, a 7, a 10 would be, and was very disciplined about scoring folks against that. And that's one of the unique things about hiring salespeople relative to hiring marketers or engineers or finance people is the success of a salesperson is the most quantifiable compared to all those other functions. So we as leaders who are striving to achieve predictable growth, we should lean into that. And that's what this process did. So if you go to the next slide, it was actually interesting to reflect on the hires that we made, even when we only made 3 or 4 in a given period, and reflect on how they were doing and what caused that success. And if you're on the phone and you're talking about even larger scale and even faster hiring, like we had the opportunity to actually run a regression analysis. Scary word, but just a stats tool that allowed us to take these quantitative measures and correlate them to success in our environment. And this is all the way back in 2008, 2009. And so this was the first result. Don't over obsess over this result, because I'm going to tell you where we ended up. But what you see here is a bunch of criteria. The ones at the top with the big blue bar going on the right, those are the ones that were most strongly correlated. And the ones toward the bottom actually were negatively correlated with success. And this, I was just like blown away by this, because if you look at the things at the bottom and you think about what, if we surveyed people, like, what do you think salespeople, how would you describe a salesperson. I think the words objection handling, convincing, closing ability would come up pretty high in that list. And those were actually negatively correlated in this result. And if you were to ask someone, how would you describe a good consultant or a good advisor, I think preparation and domain experience and intelligence would crop up in that list, and those were the most strongly correlated. So really early on, we actually saw this result. Now over time, I can tell you that for our particular context, there are actually 5 criteria that cropped up to the top, and I'll show you those on the next slide. I believe that's where we're going, and that was coachability, curiosity, intelligence, work ethic, and prior success. Those are really the 5 that cropped up for us.
Mark, I was just going to say, like, this is.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is incredible data and insight. In the first 2 years of my business, I actually think like we got behind the 8 ball because as a sales leader hiring sales professionals, I hired with my gut, with no empirical evidence, and I batted well under 500 in the first 2 years of hiring, because I thought I could smell a sales professional, like just coming down the street, bam, you should be selling for me. What I recognized right away, and this is what I remember when I heard your book, and when I see this, adaptability and kind of interest to learn and be a sponge to learn has been a learning for me over the last couple of years of what's so critical, because especially in the city of Toronto, so many sales professionals come from SaaS software companies, as an example, product-based software companies like Salesforce or Eloqua or so forth, but then they're dumped into the entrepreneurial world of consulting, and that transition, as you just talked about, is so mind-boggling from a resources standpoint, from an accountability standpoint, that they don't succeed. And I wish I had have known some of these elements in those first early hires. This is great.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jamie. And I just a warning to the folks on the call: don't necessarily obsess with these 5. All right. Remember, this is very context-driven, and that's the point here, and that's the point that Jamie's making as well. Is people fall into major potholes when they think about their buddy who built this amazing sales team, and they just say, who did you hire and what did you look for? And you got to appreciate that that answer might be different for your company because of a change in context. Now, if you're on the phone and you're an early stage venture with an evangelistic type play, I would bet these 5 are going to be important to you. But the main point here is twofold. Number one, make sure that you have built into your cadence, whether you're hiring 2 reps this year or 200 reps this year, some sort of way to measure this during the interview process and reflect on success once these folks are hired and onboarded. And number 2, pay close attention to historic biases of what we perceive as a good salesperson and all the great stuff that Mary's been talking about and that some of our research has shown, is that that bias is probably different. That perception is very different because it changes in the buyer context. And let's put a lot of effort into finding those folks and properly onboarding to your organization.